Okay, we've got some people joining, so thank you all very much for joining us today. This is our Ask Mayfield Anything series, and today we're going to be talking about the IRA and some of the newer guidance that came out, and we have some panelists here that will help us kind of talk through some of these issues and yeah, hopefully answer some of your questions and get through that. So as everybody's joining in, we encourage questions. Love having the interaction. So what we ask is use the Q&A section of the Zoom meeting for the questions. The chat we will use, we have some resources that we'll push out to the group as a whole, but if you have questions and you put them in the Q&A section, it's a lot easier for us to follow along, grab those. And so please, if you can, use that section for exactly that. So welcome again, and let's go ahead and get going. So for those of you who may not know me, my name is Ryan Mayfield. I'm the founder of Mayfield Renewables, and we are, I'll be your host today. We have a great lineup of guests here in order to go through our topics, but thank you all very much for joining. A little bit about Mayfield Renewables, who we are. So I founded Mayfield back in 2007, and we're committed to providing education and expertise where it's needed for EPCs, developers, manufacturers. And so this AMA series is one of those ways that we provide that and are helping with that mission. And at Mayfield, we do design and engineering, we do project consulting and product consulting. So always happy to talk with folks on any of these topics that we might be able to support you on. Okay, with that, I'm going to, I want to introduce our guests. We have three great folks with different perspectives, different vantage points on this topic. And so I'm going to go ahead and let everybody introduce themselves so that make sure that I don't butcher it. Angela, we'll start with you. Appreciate you joining us. But yeah, can you give us a little bit of background on who you are and what you're doing?
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Hi, everybody. Angela Crowley-Koch. I'm the Executive Director of OSEA, the Oregon Solar and Storage Industries Association. And happy to talk about the IRA today. Also want to encourage everyone here to join OSEA if you do work in Oregon, and to join our national organization, SEA, who helped negotiate the IRA and got all these good provisions about for solar into the bill. So they're a great resource and a great organization, and so are we. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Angela. And I do have to say a big thanks to all three of you, but a special thanks to Angela, because this was a very last minute ask of her to join in. So our original third person came ill, so wasn't able to join. And so Angela was very, very kind in joining and stepping in last moment. So thank you very much there. Geoff, we'll just continue right down the line.
Sure.
So
thanks, Ryan.
Yeah,
appreciate it. Geoff Oxnam. I'm the CEO and founder of American Microgrid Solutions. We're a microgrid development firm working nationwide, and we focus on critical community facilities in this middle market that we're going to discuss today. So really excited to hear the questions and participate in the conversation, and just appreciate the opportunity to be here with such a great group.
Great. Thanks, Geoff. And Mark.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Goodrow. I'm the general manager of Solectria Renewables, also known as Yaskawa Solectria Solar. We're based our headquarters are in Massachusetts, but our production is in the Midwest, in Buffalo Grove, Illinois, and in Wisconsin. So for those who don't know us, we are probably the longest standing PV inverter manufacturer in the US that are still building inverters in the US. And happy to be here today to talk more about the great incentives that we're getting with this IRA.
Great, thanks, Mark. So we'll jump right into it. So, the title, how the IRA brings new life to the middle markets. And one of the things I want to, before we even jump in, before you start any slides, point out, we are not tax professionals. This is not should be considered, tax advice or anything like that. This really is a group of folks that are paying very close attention to this aspect of the industry and, want to just help everybody understand kind of what's out there. So make sure that you are talking to your tax professionals when you're putting all of this in play, making your performance, things like that. And yeah, making sure that you're getting the best advice possible. Okay, so what are the solar middle markets? And so this one, actually, when we started talking about this topic, it's funny because middle markets was a term that I hadn't really felt like I'd heard very much before. And then once we talked about it, I started seeing it everywhere and hearing it everywhere. So it's kind of one of those things. And it makes a lot of sense when you just think about, where it is. But we have, different aspects. We have residential installations, we have utility scale. And so we have, the small installations, we have the utility scale, very, very large scale installations. And in between those are what we're calling the middle market. So commercial, industrial, community solar, microgrids, the projects that are not, your typical residential or something would be considered utility scale. That's the slice we're talking about here. And you can see it's right there in the middle of the graph too. And so, we are going to focus really the topics today around that. But of course, the IRA is going to have implications on both sides of that. So when we are talking about it, that's where Mayfield really puts our focus, and American Microgrid, that's a big part of your focus. And then of course, Yaskawa has their products there. So it all fits well with what we're doing. And I know SIA has lots of C&I types of membership. So that's what the focus of today is. But of course, all of these aspects, all of these sectors will come into play for the IRA. So just wanted to kind of set that stage, what we're talking about middle markets with our systems. So with that, on the policy update, I'll have Angela kind of take over from here and kind of give us the rundown on kind of what that update is on the IRA and the money and the allocations.
Great, thanks, Ryan. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this slide. This is kind of the general overview of all of the wonderful stuff that happened in the Inflation Reduction Act. So exciting to have that ITC, and now a new thing, now solar projects can take the production tax credit or the PTC for 10 years and brings those tax credits back up to 30% if particular things are mentioned or are included and added for projects over 1 megawatt, but I'll get into that on the next slide. So the enhancements to the ITC and PTC are these adder bonus credits for labor requirements, domestic content minimums, energy community projects and built-in energy communities, or for low-income ratepayers. We'll get into that on the next slide. But then it does have new financing mechanisms, this transferable tax credit and direct pay options. So those are good things that we're happy to see back in our area. We can go to the next slide. So I'm sorry, there was a lot on one slide. You can find this in a more legible format on the SIA website. I mentioned before, I'll put this in the chat, and I'll say again that SIA was really involved in the passage of the IRA and negotiating all these provisions. They have really great resources that go through exactly what's in there, and have staff devoted to working with Treasury on the guidance. So they have member-only resources, which are super helpful. So if you haven't joined SIA, I really recommend it. So here's the breakdown on how the ITC affects all of these kind of middle projects. So the projects under 1 megawatt, so some of your commercial and community solar projects, you can see there in very small print that I'm gonna look in I don't know if you can zoom that in. That's that's a little bit better. So the ITC is 30% for projects under 1 megawatt, and you still get those two bonuses, 10% for meeting domestic content minimums and 10% for siting in what's called an energy community. And those are brownfields. They are areas that used to have fossil fuel infrastructure. And so there's a map that has been put out and a little more guidance that you can find on what exactly those communities are. But you can see that it's not just a 30% ITC anymore. It can be up to a 50% and actually even greater. If you look at that next line, which is really hard to read, is this allocated low-income bonus adders. So these are things that you actually have to apply to get. And those are for low-income communities or projects on tribal lands, or for qualified low-income residential building projects, or qualified low-income economic benefit projects. So again, those are very specifically defined, and you need to apply for those. And you need to be careful about how the median income is defined by the IRS, as opposed to potentially other programs that you have in your state. So for example, in Oregon, for community solar, low income is described as 80% of the state median income, and for this, it is described as 80% of the area median income. So make sure you're paying really close attention to those details if you're thinking about applying.
So Angela, will that be a state by state requirement? Is that where that level will get dictated?
So for across the board, it's the area media income is how it's defined. But just make sure when you're matching it up with existing programs in your state that might define low income in a different way. So just make sure you're using the correct metric when you're applying and trying to match up those different incentives.
Okay.
So moving to projects over 1 megawatt that got in that window less than 60 days after the Treasury issues guidance, that period is over. But if your project started in that window, you just got that 30%. You didn't have to worry about the domestic content and the labor requirements. For everyone else, all other projects over 1 megawatt that began 60 days after the Department of Treasury guidance, your base ITC went down to 6%. And so now there's a lot of incentive to meet these other adders, the domestic content minimums, siting and energy community. But the big one, as you can see here, hopefully you can see here on the slide, is a 24% adder for meeting labor requirements. And so these labor requirements are apprenticeship standards and prevailing wage standards. And so there's a lot of incentive, obviously, to meet those. And that 24% will bring you back up to the 30%. When you meet those, you still have that domestic content minimum adder and the energy community adder. And then you'll see this very last slice at the bottom is, again, allocated low-income bonuses for projects under 5 megawatts. So again, these are things that you need to apply to. This is helpful for community solar projects. But again, make sure you're reading the fine print and getting the low-income definition correct. And then I'm also going to put in the chat here, make sure, as always, in addition to consulting your tax professionals, you're looking at the IRS guidance documents. Lucas, we can go to the next slide. And all that information, by the way, that table, again, that's the fact sheet, the public fact sheet that everyone has access to. So I'll just briefly talk about some of the other pieces in the IRA. The first one being the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. There's a piece of that fund called Solar for All. And so that can be used mostly for solar projects that benefit low-income ratepayers. That can be residential projects, commercial projects, and community solar projects. So in Oregon specifically, so the state would apply to these, to access these funds. And in Oregon, our Department of Energy is planning on applying, and funding would go towards our solar plus storage rebate program for low-income ratepayers only, and for community solar program, again, for low-income ratepayers only. I imagine that's $7 billion in the Solar for All piece, and I imagine it will be very competitive to get those funds. Next, of course, is the domestic manufacturing tax credit. I'll leave all of those details for our next speaker. And then lastly, some pieces about transmission, loan authority, and then money for the Department of Energy to issue grants to public entities or tribal entities to help facilitate siting transmission. So those are some good things. Try and speed up the slow process of transmission siting, but it's only so fast they can go, but it is helpful. So that's my overview. I can take some questions now or wait till the end. Thanks.
I'm actually going to go backwards, Angela, because I had a question that I wanted to on the slide, or I guess maybe somewhat of a point too. So one of the things that I think is important and exciting is just the window that we have here. So, we're looking out into 2036. And one of the questions that I had, it seems like this is very stable, and it's been kind of one of the hard parts for the industry is the uncertainty of this. And so I guess what is my question is, what is the how stable should we feel about this? I mean, is this something that can go away with the next Congress, or what's the reality of that situation?
Yeah, I mean, anything's possible, depending on the ebbs and flows of politics. However, Congress doesn't usually take money away that has been promised. In fact, they usually go the other way. And I speak from the experience of having worked for Senator Geoff Merkley previously, and tax credits usually get extended. They usually don't get repealed before the end of their lifespan. However, you never know what's going to happen, but I think we can feel fairly confident.
Okay, great.
And then I also, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I saw a question in the chat there about accessing these documents.
Mm-hmm.
I'll put a link in the chat. So SEIA does have a public fact sheet, and that's where this particular slide came from. And then they have member access only, more detailed information, like that map that is for members only. But I believe there is now a public entity that has put out the map, although I don't have the link to that readily available.
Perfect, thank you. And so am I reading this right? So I'm looking at 2023. I'm just going to look at the very top line under megawatt, because the megawatt is the threshold for the, as I understand it, threshold for the labor requirements. And so you 30% base ITC, and then if there's, and we'll have Mark get into this on the manufacturing content or the domestic content and the energy community. So that would be 50%. And then if you apply and get those other funds, is this total of 80% potential? Am I missing something?
It could be. I mean, I think you'd have to be a very particular project to be able to take advantage of all of those. And my guess is if you're applying for one of those allocated low-income bonuses, you're only going to qualify for one or the other. Okay. Great. Well, thank you for that. Really appreciate it. And so we'll skip forward and get into one of these points, and that is on the domestic content. So Mark, if you could kind of talk us through just the domestic content aspect, and I'm sure some questions will come up along the way.
All right, thanks very much. Yeah, so let me start there by just sort of describing the three buckets of incentives that apply to manufacturers. Basically, the first option is you can get the 48C manufacturing tax credit. That's a 30% tax credit if you want to build out a new factory or just expand your factory to build inverters or modules or trackers. There's a second incentive called the 45X advanced production tax credit. That's probably the most impactful for manufacturers, because you're actually getting a rebate for each product that you ship. And I'll talk a little more about that later. And then finally, so those are two direct incentives, and it's an either or case there. You can't do both. You can't double dip. So you either have to elect the capital expense or the production tax credit. And the final one is really, I would call it an indirect incentive for manufacturers, and direct incentives for the EPCs and developers, which are these credits, the long-term investment tax credits. But the one I want to really focus on is the domestic content credit. That's an additional 10% that you get beyond the 30%, so it'd be 40% total if you meet the domestic content requirements. So it's really an incentive for companies, for developers to buy products from US manufacturers. And if we go to the next slide. So, by the way, we're looking through this as a lens of an inverter manufacturer, but this applies also to modules and trackers and anything else that would qualify as an applicable product for a PV system. The tax credits run for 10 years, and you get 100% of the credit for the first 7 years, and then it tapers off near the end. And again, using the example of inverters, for this middle market, which we're talking about, and by the way, this is really the core, it's been the core market for Solectria since we began years ago. So we have inverters that address, the commercial and community solar and smaller utility scale. But basically, with this 45X credit, we or any other manufacturer would get a tax credit for each inverter we produce and sell. Just for an example, if it's a 60 kilowatt inverter, it'd be $1,200 per inverter. So it's a really good incentive to get people to build new factories with the knowing that they'll be able to scale up their business and be profitable and be able to price competitively with some other folks.
And just to be clear, Mark, this is the IRA 45X. That is that's something that you, the manufacturer, are taking advantage of?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, this is actually a benefit for the manufacturer. And you need something like this for someone to take the risk of building these multi-million-dollar factories in a market that we know can be very competitive.
And do you know, I'm just curious, and maybe you do or don't know. So this is, I see 2 cents per watt for the inverter capacity. Are there similar metrics in terms of for module output? I would imagine like module ratings, and then I guess if there's racking though, do you know how they, what that account? How they account?
Yes, yeah, they're similar. They're similar. Basically by the different components, like in terms of modules, you get different incentives both for producing the modules, but also the cells and even the wafers.
Okay.
So it's pretty comprehensive. It's complicated, and it is going to take time, especially for the module manufacturers, to be able to get that whole value chain, in the domestic market. But that's the real purpose, is to give these strong credits to make it profitable to do that.
And have you received guidance on, what it means to be, what the level of manufacturing, and I'll stick to inverters since that's what you all are doing, kind of what that level of production needs to be in the US in order to qualify?
Well, there's no level of production that's required. It's really but for in the case of an inverter, you have to be building the inverter. All the manufacturing processes need to take place in the US.
Okay. You
can use subcomponents that might be from outside the US,
okay.
But it still has to be manufactured in the US.
Okay.
So we could switch to the next slide, please. So just going on with this, so to talk more about how the domestic content bonus works. I mentioned before, this is additional 10% tax credit, and that's 10% on the whole project cost. So it's pretty significant. But to reach that, it's pretty, it's a bit of work right now to get to what you have to do, and that's 100% of the domestic steel and iron content has to be made in the U.S. And all of the sum of all the manufactured products that are used in the system have to add up to more than 40% domestic content, and that threshold actually will increase over time. So it's 40% now, and it'll peak at 55% in 2027. So I put a little pie chart on the right just to show for us, for Solectria, since we had been manufacturing in the U.S. and early on we wanted to qualify for various U.S. type bonuses, such as Made in America or so we probably had a head start here. And going through the latest guidance, we've been able to show that our domestic content is above 60% for our inverters. In the end, we know that there are other companies planning to build factories for inverters. There's been probably at least 45 now, I think, new production facilities have been announced in the U.S. across the value chain. So there's a lot of activity going on with new factories for the modules, for inverters, for trackers, and actually, if you go to the next slide, I think it shows sort of what these are the components that to date have been identified as qualifying applicable project components. And this was for a recent guidance that came out from the Treasury Department. And they defined this as a utility project, but I think this would hold true of these commercial projects as well. This is not a comprehensive list of these components, but it's the ones that have already been safe harbored into the rulemaking. So, PV modules, inverters, and trackers are all considered manufactured products. Steel would include PV module racking, piles of ground screws, or foundations. So again, not a comprehensive list, but these are the ones that count. And to meet that manufactured product threshold, again, it's got to be the sum of all of those manufactured products. The domestic content of the module, the inverter, the tracker has to be above 40%.
I'm really curious on how does that, do you know how that 40% is calculated? So, I mean, we have 6 items here. Does that mean that the 40% of those 6 have to be manufactured U.S. domestic product? Or is it, modules there's many more modules than there are inverters. So is there a threshold there? Is there a metric there around the different components?
Yeah, here's where it gets tricky and can go into the weeds. But yeah, it's basically the sum of all these components. I mean, each manufacturer has to identify the amount of domestic content. So the domestic content in the inverter, the tracker, you do it separately, and it's the developer or the buyer who then sort of does a calculation, adding up the total percentage of domestic content in each of those manufactured products. The domestic content goes in the numerator, the total cost goes in the denominator, and that has to then be above 40%.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so this is going to put a lot of developers are going to have to be paying a lot of attention and really paying attention to what they're buying, where they're getting it from, and be able to document that. It seems like the documentation aspect of it is going to be quite daunting.
Documentation is going to be a big part of it. There's a certification requirement at the end of this when you submit for the domestic content bonus credit. As the owner, the developer, you do have to certify that you've met the threshold. There's even been some concerns about manufacturers being unwilling to even share some of these costs because they're looking for actual direct labor and parts costs. So some people might consider that to be secret information that they want to share, but
Right.
we'll figure it out, working together, how we'll be able to transfer the information so that this can be, applied for.
Right. So Kevin, I think that was just what I was just trying to ask you. Kevin asked percent of what, pounds, weight, dollars, etc. And so it sounds like it's each individual component, and you're going to look at all of those as a whole, and it's the domestic content per component.
Right. It's the direct material costs and the direct labor costs that are counted.
So material costs and labor costs
Yes.
so that's what you're saying, Mark. The manufacturers it's going to be a tough one to get some of that information from them,
Right.
because then they're giving up some of their back-end secrets, I guess, back-end information in a sense.
And this is an area I mentioned up front. There's the final rules here aren't yet in place, and there's ongoing, I think, discussions with Department of Energy and U.S. Treasury about relaxing some of these requirements. But again, we want to strike a balance to make sure that in the end it does provide enough incentive for the manufacturers to build out these new factories.
Sure. And I see steel PV module racking. So, if there's aluminum being involved, that's going to be, would that bump it into a manufactured product, or has that been discussed?
No, I don't know the exact answer to that, but I think in the best case, it just wouldn't count. Worst case, it could potentially disqualify if it wasn't U.S. steel.
Okay. Interesting. Great. Okay. So for developers, I'm going to move over to Geoff and kind of talk a little bit about, what that impact is on developers. And sounds like, Geoff, you've got a lot more work ahead of you from what I'm hearing from Mark. So a lot more documentation. So I'll let you kind of talk about some of these key points that you have here.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan, and really appreciate the comments by Mark and Angela. I think one of the themes that we're all going to see throughout this presentation today is that this is still a work in progress. The core pieces have been put in place. They are going to be there, and they will be over the long haul, but there are pieces that are being sorted out. The IRS is still issuing guidelines right now that are in for different components of the IRA that are in public comment periods before they become final. So I want to caution everybody that, yes, while this is going ahead, the specifics are still being finalized and nailed down. And I'll also repeat the disclaimer, big red lights, right? I am not a lawyer, nor am I a certified public accountant. I am not providing legal guidance. I am not providing tax or financial guidance. You're on your own. Talk to your professional. Use some common sense. Awesome. So taking a look at what the IRA means for developers today, as we're in the midst of it, we're already seeing an impact of the IRA before everything is finalized and on the ground. And I think back to when I launched my company, American Microgrid Solutions, we were still wondering whether or not the ITC was going to go away, whether it was going to be extended. And we had that first extension. There was so much uncertainty in the market that it really discounted the economics of a lot of projects that sat on the shelf because they weren't sure what the tax status was going to be. I think the greatest benefit of the IRA, in addition to the financial benefits, is just the certainty of knowing where things are going to be over a longer time horizon. So what are we seeing from the trenches in the development world? Well, if you look at our pipeline, the quantity of our prospects are still about the same year over year over year. I was just sort of looking over when Ryan asked me to participate in this, I looked at our pipeline for the last few years and some of the trends in it. The quantity is about the same, but the quality is vastly improving. And from a developer standpoint, what I mean by the quality are projects that are not just tire kickers, but ones that really want to move forward. Ones that are willing to take the initiative to be able to evaluate, do the feasibility analysis and forecasting to see whether or not a microgrid or a solar system or whatnot makes sense to them. That's rapidly increasing. So there are a lot more solid prospects in that middle market that Ryan has carved out here. I'll also, just a parenthetical comment, if the middle market is between small resi and giant utility scale, that's a huge swath of the market. There are subsets within that middle market at all to consider. What else are we seeing? Stalled projects are getting unstuck. This is probably the most promising aspect. Projects where folks were committed, they wanted to do it, but they weren't ready to pull the trigger are now going to construction. And we've seen about a 4x to 6x increase in that activity. At the same time, that means that sales cycles are shrinking. One of the biggest concerns in the middle market is it takes an awful long time between when there's a twinkling in a client's eyes and when a project is ready to go forward. That is starting to, we are seeing demonstrably that is decreasing. Now, as my old stats professor would say, right, correlation and causality are not the same thing. There is some of the IRA helping to move this along, and there is also some of just the market coming to maturity in it. But we are seeing the tradition, these aspects, and we're seeing capital come down market. When I started this, most capital wouldn't look at a project under $20 million. And then as the years went on, it sort of squinted and said, okay, if your project's around $10 million, that's okay. Well, that's not where most of the middle market is. It's particularly the breadth of the volume of commercial real estate. Now we're seeing people willing to entertain sub-$1 million projects, particularly if they're aggregated into portfolios. And the IRA is certainly helping that. What we're also seeing, one word of caution in this, and it came up earlier. I'm really glad Angela mentioned it. We get focused a lot on the investment tax credit and all of these adders, and people are starting to get these really sexy, financial models to look at all the different ways to parse that out. There's a lot more to the IRA than just the investment tax credit and the production tax credit implications. Those other IRA provisions are going to have a really big impact, particularly in low to moderate income communities and nonprofits and elsewhere. So I would emphasize too that you're going to find in looking at the middle market projects with the IRA, you're not going to be able to go it alone. You're going to find very often that the best way to utilize some of these adders and the bonuses is going to be working with partners in the community with projects that aren't just low to moderate income on their own, but are part of a larger community initiative that can be supported by other sources of funding. Likewise, the technical side of it. One of the really frightening things I think we've seen in this industry is anytime the money starts to look good, you get all sorts of people crashing in from other industries who may or may not know what they're talking about. And it is critical that you sit down and really understand how the projects work, forgetting even getting to the finance side, but understanding the components and their elements. That's why a Mayfield is so important to what gets done in this industry, because Ryan and his team are expert at being able to parse out what does and doesn't work in systems, and how they comply with regulations and other provisions that are absolutely critical. So keep an eye on all sorts of like new faces you didn't expect to be in the industry coming in that suddenly are microgrid or solar experts. And that gets to the last point, focus on the basic block and tackling of development, right? Most of the work isn't being cute with the finance. It is going through the process of understanding the pieces. Next slide, please. So where are we seeing the opportunities? Well, a big swath of the market now has the option to monetize directly, right? So there are a couple of ways that's happening. The elective or direct option for those who qualify, nonprofits, tribal governments, government agencies, and others are now able to take advantage of the tax credit equivalent rather than having to monetize through a third party. What does that mean? Well, before, if you didn't have a tax appetite, if you were tax exempt, in order for you to take advantage of the money that was out there, you had to find somebody who owed taxes, have him invest in the project, and then you got the benefit from whatever the deal was, the PPA or whatever you had between you and the third party. Now there's the opportunity to get that finance directly. That doesn't mean everybody's going to do it. In fact, we're finding that most people still in the nonprofit sectors or in government or whatever are in the business of doing what that nonprofit does or that government agency does. And they would still like the benefits of the third party finance. So it isn't suddenly cutting the spigot off of third party deals. It is, I think, in a lot of ways, helping to enhance it. The transferability of the tax credits too increases the number of different financial partners that can come into jobs. You can take, if you don't have the full tax equity appetite, you have the ability to sell or otherwise transfer portions of it. So that is, that's attractive as well. Certainly one of the biggest opportunities and a key driver in this is the boost energy equity, which is a key topic. I won't get into this because we're talking about the nuts and bolts of the provision here, but important part of what this is all about. Risk reduction as well. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, now that we have a little bit better optics on where things are going to be down the road, we can significantly reduce the risk of people saying, well, I can't invest because the tenor is too short on this deal. Some of the challenges, there are requirements that temper the savings, right? There's no two ways about it. When you hear prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, that is typically associated with a higher cost of labor that goes into the projects. And there are some key places you got to pay attention to, not just in the requirement for projects over a megawatt, but in the domestic requirements, there are aspects that will require that prevailing wage to fully maximize all the benefits and credits that are out there. This again is a place where you need to be working with your lawyer and your accountant to make sure you're ticking all the right boxes. Some of the adders and bonuses that are in here have caps on them, and they have short application windows, like 60-day application windows. And there's going to be a lot of effort rushing in to be able to get take advantage of those projects and opportunities. So expect a bit of a rush when the applications do come out, and the first set of them I think are due out in Q3. That could mean too that it'll be awfully tough to get some of your EPC folks on the phone because they're going to be really busy, and others in the development community. So those are some of the areas to take a look at. Complexity creates uncertainty. And again, these are not final. So while overall the level of risk from certainty has been reduced, there's a lot of short term right now, and people are going to be, as Mark pointed out, saying, well, wait a minute, how does this calculation work on, this aspect of the domestic content? Or what is qualifying as an LMI community? I'm really glad that Angela brought up a tripwire that we've seen in a lot of states we work with, where folks are saying, well, our definition of LMI is this. Yes, but that doesn't meet the definition in the regulations. So that is another area developers are going to be spending a lot of time. At the end of the day, one of the biggest challenges is managing expectations. everybody has felt like, and rightly so, there's a lot of enthusiasm and exuberance in this, but there are limitations and caps. And so developers responsibly need to make sure that we're talking to our clients and helping them understand what they can and what they can't do, because there's nothing worse than when somebody goes to the community they're serving and says, hey, we're going to be able to put this wondrous thing together, and then find out that for a technicality, they cannot. So that's sort of my outlook at it. From a developer standpoint, we are spending a lot of time looking at how the stackable bonus credits work and the individual bonus credits. What is qualifying in a low to moderate income community? My firm works in a lot of low to moderate income communities. So making sure that all of those pieces are aligned properly so that we can deliver the benefit they need is a big focus right now.
Awesome. Thanks, Geoff. That was great. We'll kind of go to these key takeaways, and I see there's a lot of good questions on here, and also had a question come in ahead of time. So I want to make sure that we try and get to as many of these as we possibly can. And so, we kind of have these key takeaways, things that we talked about. One of the things, Geoff, yesterday, and we talked about this already yesterday when we were, getting prepped here a little bit. Question that came in saying, with changes in particular to tax equity structures for C&I microgrid developments, how do EPCs and developers efficiently access financing products when developing proposals for clients? And, this is not my area of expertise by any means. And, I think even when I read that, I think that there's a lot to that question, and there's probably a lot of it depends answers with that. So I guess, do you have any guidance, just kind of what, I don't think there's any one answer for this, but rather, as you were talking, some of the things you already talked about, but, kind of what are those steps, or what are the things that you're doing to help, again, minimize some of those risks and apply for these financing products?
Yeah, no, excellent point, and really the right answer, that it gets down to the specifics of each individual job or project. When you see efficiently structured, that is generally referring to tax efficiently structured, so that the finance is set up to maximize those advantages, and that is going to depend entirely on the owner of the system and the specific conditions around which the entity that's owning that system is set up. In general, I will say, one, have a deep bench of potential capital partners. One of the things that has changed dramatically over the last, say, 5 years, the amount of capital coming into the market has not only increased dramatically, but is also a lot more diversified. So by that, I mean, there are a lot more funds that have particular interests. We invest in projects, but they have to be $1 million or more, and they have to have a carbon reduction of X, and they have to, the more of those funds that are out there, they come with a particular investment thesis, and you need to understand that in order to maximize the efficiency with them. So set up that way. Two, don't assume you're going to build a model right now that has a one size fits all for all of these projects, because it is so site specific. So make sure that you have the right, obviously, lawyer and accountant, but you also have the right technical partners to be able to navigate you through that.
Great, thanks. Well, and one of the things I wanted to make sure that kind of maybe reiterate or point out, I don't think I did a great job at the beginning, is, we focus on the middle market, these C&I spaces, and reality is that part of the market has grown slower than utility scale, residential scale. And these systems are technically, they are complex, and financially they're very complex. And so the kind of one of the things we wanted to talk about, and why we wanted to focus on this, was with the IRA it's not going to help with the technical aspect by any means, but it's the financial aspect. It's going to help grow that sector of the market. And so it's a really exciting, to me, advance and the possibilities that we have and the opportunities that are being provided here are great. So I just want to kind of reiterate that on terms of why the middle market versus these other ones when we're talking about the IRA. Couple questions came in, and Mark, I'm going to throw them over to you to see how you feel, if you can help answer this. But they're kind of, both questions I think they're around the domestic content, and I think they're similar in terms of what they're asking. And so it's the question that Mark asked was, how reasonable is it to reach the current 40% domestic content to get that 10% bonus if the modules are completely imported? And so what do you have to, I guess, do you have a comment on that in terms of, because of that metric or that calculation, how it's going in? And it seems like the modules are going to be kind of a big factor in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the what's considered manufactured products currently, the ones, the safe harbor, it's really just those three I mentioned. It's the module, tracker, and the inverter. And, obviously the module is the most highest cost item there. To get to 40%, there'd have to be some domestic content in that module to get there.
Okay. So is it pretty, I mean, I get, yeah, you'd have to run all the numbers and you want to make an overarching statement, but it seems like with the way that is being calculated, and the way the modules are.
I mean, I don't think it needs to be 100% made in the US, but if you're making the modules themselves, but you're importing the wafers or the cells, that might be enough. But you have to add the cost of all those manufactured products and then divide it by the total cost.
Okay. So yeah, so it seems like, I mean, to that point, the modules are going to be a pretty key thing, and we're seeing a lot of module manufacturers making that investment now, and I just don't know how long it's going to take.
Absolutely. Q-cells and more, several have already announced, and I think that the concern right now is how quickly they can get to a point where they have meaningful domestic content.
Great. And Angela's been super efficient in answering a bunch of questions here. So thank you for doing that, Angela. I appreciate that. So this question that just came in, Asher asks, has the Treasury announced the final map for the energy community areas to get an extra 10%? I don't know, Angela, you might have the best line on that.
I think they have, but I haven't seen the map myself. So I'm sort of poking around on the IRS website here while we're talking to see if I can find it.
Okay.
But there are, if you go, well, I'll just put here in the chat the link to the new energy communities page on the IRS. And I bet in there, frequently asked questions, it's in there somewhere.
Okay.
And that will help too for maybe this other question about who applies for the low income adders. I believe it's going to be the project owner, but would look, okay, Geoff's nodding. Okay.
Yeah. So I'll chime in on that one. Ultimately, the property owner is, and property here, I mean the actual assets themselves, are responsible for applying for the adders and grants. You're not going to be able to do it without your contractor or tax professionals. Mark just expertly explained, figuring out what that domestic content is, certifying it, and all those pieces. You're going to need to do it with the contractor, and the contractor is going to have to do it with the manufacturers in order to get all the pieces together. When it comes to the low income adder, there are certifications that you will have to be able to provide, and you're not going to, it will be prudent to do it with one's tax professional or lawyer, obviously. A lot of, so yeah.
Great. One of the earlier questions that Angela, you typed the question out, but I thought it would be worth bringing back up. Kevin asked, is the 30% tax credit now refundable? And you were saying only for nonprofits and public entities. Can you explain a little bit what that means, refundable, and how that, I guess, how that might work for the nonprofits and public entities?
I can try. So
okay.
Going back to that map question, though, it turns out there's not a comprehensive map that the feds have released. But there is that SIA map, so once again, time to join SIA. In terms of how the other, the direct pay refundability credits work, it is complicated. And so I really want to point folks to that new guidance that was issued. I can post it again in the chat so people can see that. But there's some, I got to give it to the IRS. They do a pretty good job of having like frequently asked questions. I would go to those first before diving into the regulations, which are a little more difficult to read through.
Yeah, the IRS guidance is actually, I found it, and I don't ever say this, you can ask my wife in particular, is actually the IRS stuff is pretty useful and easy to navigate on their description of what's going on with a lot of these programs. So there is good guidance in there. There is good frequently asked questions in there to take a look at. The tax form that you would file as a nonprofit or an entity that is allowed to take the elective or direct pay option is out and available. So you can take a look at what that document is going to look like. It is not as unwieldy as I think some would have feared. But again, all of this is still in a little bit of play. So I do advise, do take a look at the IRS guidelines and explanation. A lot of good stuff out there. I'll also, as a resource, a lot of large law firms that have specialty practices in this area will publish, their take on the IRA or some aspect of the IRA, and without plugging any of them directly, do a little homework around. You'll actually find some really good publicly available answers. Of course, you've got to always be careful of your sources, but there's good stuff out there.
Great. And so there's, Angela was putting in a lot of good information, so we'll make sure that that we get that. We're recording all this, so we'll be able to get those links and stuff out to everybody too, in case people miss those. Chadwin asked earlier if any of the group knows what racking, is there any racking currently US made? That one I don't know the answer to. I don't know, Mark, if you've got or Geoff, since you're on the development side, if you've got a pulse on that.
I don't know offhand. Geoff, do you?
Yeah, I can't answer it directly in terms of what the latest guidance and the regulations are. So I don't want to get over my skis on that one. We're obviously talking to a lot of our racking suppliers to make sure that they're meeting the requirements, but I can't tell you that X is and Y isn't. Okay.
Yeah, that's just one that I haven't kept track of, so sorry, I don't know exactly. Well, great. Well, we're getting really close to the top of the hour, and so wanted to pull this up, make sure people, if you have further questions or comments, anything like that, want to make sure you have our contact info. We are at Mayfield, we're happy to engage some more if there's questions or comments, follow up or anything like that. We will have this posted on our YouTube channel. Everybody who registered will get a follow-up link as well. And so, I just want to take a moment. Thank you so much to the guests, Mark, Geoff, and Angela. It was great. I know I learned a lot, as I told you right at the very beginning. I'm not my area of expertise, so I'm really appreciative that you all took your time to help answer some of these questions.
Thanks. Happy to see everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Well, with that, we'll just go ahead and wrap that up. Appreciate everybody, and I hope you all have a great day.